Someone, somewhere, saw every sign, heard every alarm, read every label, and walked straight in anyway. 101 times, the warning was right. Let's go. 1. The Titanic didn't sink because nobody saw the iceberg coming. That particular myth is far more comfortable than the truth, so let's tear it apart. On April 14th, 1912, the ship's crew had received at least 6 separate ice warning telegrams from other vessels operating in the exact same stretch of North Atlantic water. 6. They acknowledged every single one and kept moving. The final warning, sent by the Californian just 30 minutes before impact, was met with what is perhaps the most expensive dismissal in maritime history. The radio operator on duty, buried in a backlog of passenger messages, snapped back, "Keep out," "Shut up," and returned to his work. Captain Edward Smith, fully aware of the ice reports, chose to maintain near top speed of approximately 22 knots because there was commercial pressure to arrive in New York ahead of schedule. And when the ship finally went under, the 20 lifeboats on board could accommodate roughly 1,178 of the 2,224 people aboard, and many of those boats launched only partially filled because the crew hadn't been trained on maximum capacity. 6 people sent you a text saying, "Do not drive this road." You turned on cruise control. 2. Most people picture Pompeii as a city blindsided by sudden volcanic fury dropping from a clear sky with zero notice. That picture is wrong, and it is wrong in ways that should make you deeply uncomfortable. In the days before the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, the region experienced a significant earthquake swarm, which is one of the most well-documented precursors to volcanic activity that exists. This wasn't the first time either. A major earthquake had already heavily damaged the city in 62 AD, 17 years earlier, leaving the population well acquainted with the ground's instability. Multiple wells and springs in the surrounding area went dry in the days before the eruption, a direct sign of magma displacing underground water systems. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the Bay of Naples, recorded that a column of smoke and ash had been visible above the mountain for hours before the catastrophic surge hit. An estimated 2,000 people died in Pompeii, but thousands more had already fled, which tells you everything you need to know about who was paying attention and who was not. The mountain spent 2 weeks clearing its throat. The city just assumed it had allergies. 3. The Challenger explosion is one of those disasters that gets filed under unthinkable tragedy, when in reality, the more accurate filing cabinet is preventable catastrophe that someone tried very hard to prevent. Engineers Roger Boisjoli and Arnie Thompson raised formal, documented objections the evening before the January 28, 1986 launch. Their specific concern was that the O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters had never been tested or certified to function at temperatures as low as the 29 degrees Fahrenheit forecast for launch morning. This was not a vague worry. Boisjoli had written an internal memo in July of 1985, 6 months prior, explicitly stating that a catastrophic failure was a real possibility if the O-ring problem was not addressed. NASA's response to the engineers' objections during that final pre-launch discussion has become one of the most damning lines in the history of institutional decision-making. A manager reportedly told the Thiokol team to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. They reversed their no-launch recommendation. The Rogers Commission, investigating the aftermath, called the decision-making process a serious breach. The engineers handed management a signed document saying, "This will explode." Management filed it under schedule concerns. 4. Chernobyl gets remembered as a freak accident, a single catastrophic miscalculation during a routine test run by exhausted workers in a broken system. That framing lets far too many people off the hook. The RBMK reactor's core design flaw, its positive void coefficient, meaning the reactor could become dangerously more reactive as coolant boiled away, was known to Soviet nuclear physicists before the plant ever went operational. It was classified as a state secret and deliberately withheld from the operators who were running the machine every day. On the night of April 25th into 26th, 1986, those operators disabled the emergency core cooling system, ran the reactor far below its recommended minimum power level, and withdrew nearly all control rods beyond permitted limits to keep their test running on schedule. When someone finally pressed the emergency shutdown button, the design flaw caused a brief, massive power surge instead of a shutdown, because the graphite-tipped control rods momentarily increased reactivity as they entered the core. The shift foreman on duty reportedly had less than 2 months of experience at a nuclear facility. They turned off every single alarm in the building to test whether the fire alarm worked. It did. 5. The Johnstown flood of 1889 killed more than 2,200 people, and for over a century, it has been packaged as a story about a dam that simply couldn't hold against nature's force. It is not that story. Engineers had been issuing warnings about the South Fork Dam's structural problems for over a decade before it failed. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private retreat for some of the wealthiest industrialists in America, had purchased the dam in 1879 and immediately began making cost-cutting modifications. They lowered the dam's height to widen a road across its crest. They removed a functional discharge pipe. They covered the spillway with iron screens to keep their fish from escaping downstream. Local engineers and community members repeatedly sent written warnings about the dam's deteriorating condition to the club and to officials. Every warning was either dismissed or ignored. On May 31st, 1889, heavy rainfall raised the reservoir until water began flowing over the earthen dam. Club officials spent several hours attempting repairs with shovels before the structure gave way entirely. A telegram warning was sent to Johnstown. Residents didn't take it seriously because there had been so many false alarms before. They had patched a crumbling dam with shovels and good vibes. The river took notes. 6. The Ford Pinto's deadly fuel tank is usually presented as a tragic engineering oversight, a flaw that Ford simply failed to catch before the car hit the road. The truth is significantly worse, and it involves a spreadsheet. Ford's own internal documents, later obtained during litigation, showed that engineers had identified the Pinto's rear-mounted fuel tank vulnerability to rupture and fire in rear-end collisions during pre-production testing. The company knew. What followed that knowledge is what turned this into one of the most infamous corporate decisions in American history. Ford's internal analysis calculated the cost of recalling and fixing all affected vehicles at approximately $137 million. It then calculated the estimated total liability payouts for projected deaths, injuries, and vehicle fires at approximately $49.5 million. The company chose the cheaper number. The fix that would have addressed the problem cost an estimated $11 per vehicle. Between 1971 and 1978, the Pinto was involved in at least 27 deaths related to fuel-fed fires in rear-end collisions, though some estimates run significantly higher. They did the math. The math said, let it burn. They went with the math. 7. NASA engineers formally requested satellite imagery to assess wing damage on Columbia during the mission. They were denied. That single sentence should be the only thing you ever need to hear about this disaster, but the full picture is somehow worse. During launch on January 16, 2003, a briefcase-sized piece of insulating foam broke off the external tank and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing. This had happened on prior shuttle missions without catastrophic result, which is how the normalization of known risk works. Engineers in the debris assessment team formally requested that the Department of Defense use spy satellites to photograph the wing and check for damage. NASA management denied the request, in part because leadership believed that nothing could be done about it even if damage was confirmed. Internal emails from during the mission show engineers privately expressing serious concern about whether Columbia could survive re-entry. Management emails characterize those same concerns as over-speculation. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board later found that NASA's broken safety culture, including its systematic normalization of recognized risks, was as much a cause of the disaster as the physical foam strike itself. They spotted the crack, decided looking closer would only make everyone anxious, and boarded the plane. 8. The Deepwater Horizon blowout is almost always described as a sudden equipment failure under unforeseeable pressure in one of the most extreme industrial environments on Earth. That framing is doing a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of people who made a lot of decisions. In the hours before the April 20th, 2010 explosion, workers conducted a negative pressure test specifically designed to confirm the well was properly sealed. The test returned anomalous results. Engineers on the rig misread them as a success, despite pressure readings that were inconsistent with a sealed well. BP had also removed drilling mud from the well before setting a final cement plug, eliminating a key layer of pressure control. The blowout preventer, the last mechanical line of defense against exactly this scenario, had a known hydraulic leak in one of its control pods and had not been fully inspected. The Deepwater Horizon was approximately 6 weeks behind schedule and losing roughly $1 million per day in delay costs. Congressional investigations found that BP had consistently prioritized schedule and cost savings over safety across the operation. The safety equipment had a known leak. They sealed the well with optimism instead. 9. The original Tacoma Narrows Bridge earned the nickname Galloping Gertie almost immediately after it opened in July of 1940 because it visibly, dramatically oscillated in the wind. Workers crossing it reported severe motion sickness. Drivers watched the road surface roll beneath them like a wave. And yet the bridge remained open to traffic for 4 months. The designer, Leon Moisseff, had used an innovative solid plate girder design that made the bridge significantly more susceptible to wind-induced oscillation than an open truss alternative would have been. The fundamental principles of aeroelastic resonance that ultimately destroyed the bridge were not some exotic unknown phenomenon. Engineer Theodore von Karman, one of the leading aerodynamicists of the era, later noted that the relevant physics were already present in existing engineering literature. People were not just aware the bridge moved. They named it. They gave it a personality. They sold postcards of it. On November 7, 1940, sustained winds of approximately 40 miles per hour triggered catastrophic resonance, and the bridge tore itself apart. The collapse was filmed in its entirety and has been studied ever since. They named the bridge Galloping Gertie and kept the toll booths open. 4 months later, Gertie left. 10. What FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the federal government knew about New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina is not a secret. It has never been a secret. In 2001, FEMA ranked a major hurricane striking New Orleans as one of the 3 most likely catastrophic disasters in the United States, placing it alongside a terrorist attack on New York and a major earthquake in San Francisco. In 2002, an investigative series published in a New Orleans newspaper laid out in precise, almost forensic detail exactly what would happen if a major storm hit the city. It described catastrophic levee failure. It described 80% of the city underwater. It described tens of thousands of casualties. The article was widely read. In 2004, FEMA ran a simulation exercise called Hurricane Pam that essentially wargamed the Katrina scenario, including mass evacuation failures and catastrophic flooding, and produced a set of action plans in response. Those action plans were never fully implemented before the real storm arrived in August 2005. Post-Katrina investigations also found that many levee failures resulted from design and construction flaws rather than simply being overwhelmed. They ran the simulation. The simulation said, everyone dies. They filed the simulation. 11. The Bhopal disaster killed an estimated 3,787 people in the immediate aftermath of the December 3, 1984 methyl isocyanate gas release, with longer-term death estimates from related illness running as high as 15 to 20,000 people. Over 500,000 individuals were exposed. And in the months before this happened, at least 3 of the plant's critical safety systems were non-functional simultaneously. The refrigeration unit that kept the chemical cool was off. The flare tower designed to burn off escaping gas was out of service. The scrubber that would neutralize leaking gas with caustic soda was not operating. Workers at the facility had filed formal complaints about deteriorating equipment in the preceding months. The plant had been cited for safety violations in prior inspections. A 1982 internal safety audit conducted by Union Carbide's own team had identified critical deficiencies at the Bhopal facility and recommended corrective action. The full report was not acted upon. They turned off 3 separate failsafes and stored enough gas to kill a city. Turns out that is exactly what happens next. 12. The Japanese government's own independent investigation commission said it plainly in 2012. The Fukushima disaster was man-made and the result of collusion between the government, the regulators, and TEPCO. Not a once-in-a-millennium wave. Not an act of nature beyond anticipation. A man-made disaster. In 2008, TEPCO's own internal engineering study concluded that a tsunami as high as 15.7 meters was possible at the Fukushima site. The seawall stood at approximately 5.7 meters. The company did not upgrade it. The 2011 tsunami reached approximately 14 to 15 meters. Japan's Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency had separately flagged the facility's backup diesel generators, located at ground level and therefore completely vulnerable to flooding, as a critical vulnerability. Regulatory action was not taken. A 2006 government advisory had warned more broadly that Japanese nuclear plants needed updated tsunami risk assessments. Implementation was delayed and incomplete. TEPCO's own engineers told them the wave would be taller than the wall. They kept the wall the same height. 13. The Donner Party didn't stumble into catastrophe because of bad luck or impossible weather. They walked into it after an experienced mountain man looked them in the eye and told them not to. James Kleiman, a seasoned trail guide who had actually traveled the Hastings Cutoff, met the Donner Party in the early stages of their journey and specifically advised George Donner to take the established, proven trail rather than the untested shortcut. Lansford Hastings, the man promoting the cutoff as a time saver, had only ever scouted it on horseback and had never taken a wagon train through it. The Donner Party chose Hastings' recommendation over Kleiman's warning. The cutoff cost them approximately 3 weeks of critical travel time due to conditions that were brutal even by the standards of the era, including a brutal desert crossing. Those 3 weeks placed them at the Sierra Nevada Pass in late October instead of September. An early and unusually severe snowstorm trapped the party at Truckee Lake, approximately 5 miles short of the summit. Of the 87 members, 39 died. A seasoned mountain man looked them in the eye and said, "Take the other road." They took the other road. Then it started snowing. 14. Boeing designed the 737 MAX's maneuvering characteristics augmentation system to automatically push the plane's nose down if a single angle of attack sensor detected a potential stall. One sensor, not two. One. A single faulty sensor could repeatedly override pilot input and force the nose of a commercial aircraft downward. More critically, MCAS was not included in the standard flight manual provided to pilots on this aircraft type. Crews were not told the system existed. They were not trained on how to recognize it, activating, or how to respond when it did. Internal Boeing messages obtained during congressional investigations showed employees expressing serious concerns about MCAS and about the relationship between Boeing and its regulators, with one employee writing that the airplane was designed by clowns who are in turn supervised by monkeys. Lion Air Flight 6-10 crashed on October 29, 2018, killing 189 people. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed on March 10, 2019, killing 157 people. Both accidents were caused by MCAS activation, triggered by faulty sensor data that pilots had not been trained to override. They hid the chapter on what to do when the plane tries to kill you, and then acted surprised when pilots couldn't find it. 15. The Great Smog that settled over London for 5 days in December of 1952 was not a mystery. The combination of cold weather, a windless temperature inversion, and the burning of high-sulfur coal by homes and industry had produced hazardous air quality events in the city before. The conditions were understood. What followed the smog was arguably worse than the smog itself. Government ministers initially dismissed concerns about the death toll, with at least one reportedly suggesting the excess deaths were attributable to influenza rather than pollution. The actual mortality numbers told a different story. Approximately 4,000 people died in the immediate week of the smog event. Revised estimates from later epidemiological studies placed the eventual toll from smog-related respiratory and cardiovascular disease at 12,000 or higher. The government delayed publishing accurate mortality statistics for months. Meaningful clean air legislation, the Clean Air Act, was not passed until 1956, 4 years later, after sustained public pressure finally forced political action. The city turned dark yellow. People could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Officials said, probably flu. 4,000 coffins disagreed. 16. Residents of Grenfell Tower in London had been raising fire safety concerns in writing for years before the fire that killed 72 people on June 14, 2017. The Grenfell Action Group, a resident advocacy group, published a blog post in November 2016, 7 months before the fire, specifically warning that it was a matter of time before a catastrophic event at the tower, and that they feared concerns would be ignored until it is too late. That post was public. It was findable. It was not acted upon. The building had just completed a refurbishment in which exterior cladding was installed using aluminum composite panels with a polyethylene core. A fire-resistant version of this material existed. The cost difference between the flammable version and the fire-resistant version was approximately £2 per square meter. The tower also operated under a stay-put fire safety policy, meaning residents were advised to remain in their flats during a fire, which proved fatal as the cladding spread fire across the entire exterior of the building with extraordinary speed. Residents wrote, "Someone will die here," on the internet 7 months early. The cladding was flammable. The policy said, "Stay inside." All three worked together perfectly. 17. The story of the radium girls is sometimes told as a tragedy born from ignorance, as though the scientists of the 1910s simply didn't know that radium was harmful. That version of events is flatly false. The executives and scientists at the United States Radium Corporation knew the material was dangerous. The male chemists at the plant wore lead aprons and used tongs when handling radium. The female factory workers were told the paint was safe and were taught the lip dip paint technique, using their lips to shape the fine brush tip before dipping it in radium paint, which meant they ingested radium repeatedly throughout every single workday. When workers began developing severe jaw necrosis, bone cancer, and radiation-related illness, the company hired a doctor who falsified medical reports, attributing their conditions to other causes, and suppressed findings from independent researchers who had identified the real problem. Several workers eventually sued. The resulting legal cases and the public attention surrounding them contributed significantly to the establishment of occupational health and safety law in the United States, and to the broader scientific understanding of radiation's effects on the human body. The chemists wore lead suits. The workers were told to lick the brush. Management knew exactly which group was going to be fine. 18. The thalidomide birth defect tragedy is sometimes framed as a case where science simply hadn't caught up yet, where the pharmaceutical industry couldn't have known what it was dealing with. That framing collapses the moment you look at the timeline. Chemie Grunenthal, thalidomide's West German manufacturer, was receiving reports of peripheral neuritis, nerve damage causing tingling and numbness in patients, as early as 1959. That is a year before regulatory pressure mounted into anything meaningful. The company downplayed these reports in communications with regulators and continued marketing the drug aggressively, promoting it specifically as being safe enough for pregnant women with morning sickness. The claim that it was completely safe was in the marketing materials, while the adverse event reports were accumulating in the file drawer. Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, the FDA reviewer who blocked American approval, grounded her objection precisely in those peripheral neuritis reports. She recognized that a drug causing nerve damage in adult patients warranted far more thorough investigation of fetal effects before being handed to pregnant women. An estimated 10,000 children worldwide were born with severe limb malformations. Completely safe was in the marketing. The nerve damage reports were in the file drawer. The file drawer was not shared with the regulators. 19. The near-total disappearance of the Aral Sea is one of the most staggering environmental losses of the 20th century, and it is almost universally described as a gradual, unforeseen casualty of agricultural expansion. That description is incorrect in one very specific and important way. Soviet engineers and scientists calculated before the river diversion projects were fully completed, that the resulting reduction in water inflow would cause the sea to shrink dramatically. They knew. The decision to divert the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers to irrigate cotton fields in Central Asia beginning in the 1960s was made with full knowledge of the consequence to the sea. That consequence was treated as an acceptable trade-off rather than as an oversight. By 2007, the Aral Sea had shrunk to approximately 10% of its original volume. The fishing industry that had once supported tens of thousands of people collapsed entirely. Former fishing communities now sit in desert, surrounded by the salt-encrusted former seabed. The exposed lakebed contains pesticide residue and salt that wind now carries across thousands of square miles, causing respiratory illness and soil degradation across the region. They knew the sea would disappear. They wrote it into the engineering report. They drained it anyway and called it progress. 20. The Sampoong department store collapsed in Seoul on June 29, 1995, killed 502 people and injured 937 more. It took approximately 20 seconds. What is less discussed is the several hours of warning that preceded those 20 seconds. Cracks had appeared in the fifth-floor ceiling that morning, accompanied by a loud cracking sound. Employees reported these signs to management throughout the day. Management called in a structural engineer who assessed the situation and recommended immediately closing the building and conducting emergency inspections. Management declined to close the store. It was a busy sales day. Senior executives and managers then evacuated themselves from the building's upper floors without evacuating customers or lower-level staff. The building had been constructed with substandard concrete, had been modified multiple times without permits, and had a rooftop restaurant added over explicit structural objections. Heavy HVAC equipment had been dragged across the roof, further compromising the structure over time. All of this was known to the people who chose to keep the doors open and the registers running. Management heard the cracking, called their families, took the elevator down, and left the shoppers browsing on the fourth floor. 21. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 is remembered as an overwhelming act of nature that simply outpaced human preparation. A river so swollen that nothing could have held it. That memory is convenient for the Army Corps of Engineers, which had spent decades defending its levees-only flood control strategy against engineers who argued it would eventually produce exactly this outcome. James Eads in the 19th century and later competing researchers had proposed alternative strategies involving artificial outlets, floodways, and spillways to distribute flood pressure rather than concentrate it behind earthen walls. The Corps defended the levees-only position publicly and institutionally for decades. By April of 1927, 145 levees along the Mississippi had already been overtopped or broken by unprecedented rainfall. The river ultimately flooded approximately 27,000 square miles across 7 states and displaced approximately 700,000 people. The Corps' own field engineers had sent warnings in the months before the flood that the system was under severe stress. Federal strategy did not change in time. The Flood Control Act of 1928 finally mandated the floodways the Corps had resisted. Every competing engineer said the levees alone would fail. The Corps said they would not. The river picked a side. 22. The Texas City explosion on April 16, 1947, killed approximately 581 people and remains one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history. It also unfolded in front of a crowd. The SS Grand Camp was loaded with approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer when smoke was detected in its cargo hold that morning. The ship's captain chose to smother the fire by sealing the hold and pumping in steam rather than flooding it with water, a decision later criticized as a critical error that allowed heat and pressure to build instead of dissipating the fire. Dock workers and bystanders gathered at the waterfront to watch the spectacle. The Texas City Fire Department responded and positioned itself dockside to fight the blaze. The ship exploded at 9:12 in the morning. The explosion and resulting shockwave killed nearly the entire city fire department, 27 of 28 volunteer firefighters, along with hundreds of dock workers and bystanders who had gathered to watch. A second ship, the SS High Flyer, also carrying ammonium nitrate, exploded the following morning and compounded the destruction. The fire burned for over an hour in front of a crowd. Crowds don't tend to survive being 50 feet from 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate. 23. The explosive decompression of Aloha Airlines flight. 2:43 on April 28, 1988, tore away an 18-foot section of the aircraft's cabin roof at 24,000 feet and killed one flight attendant who was swept from the plane. The Boeing 737 involved was one of the most heavily cycled aircraft in the world, having completed approximately 89,680 pressurization cycles, far more than most aircraft of its type. Because of the short inter-island Hawaiian routes, it flew multiple times daily. The FAA had issued airworthiness directives warning operators of aging 737s to inspect for fuselage skin cracking caused by metal fatigue. The specific panel that failed had reportedly shown evidence of corrosion in a prior inspection report. The accident prompted the first formal aging aircraft safety program in aviation history and became a landmark event in how the industry thinks about cumulative structural stress over time. What makes it particularly difficult to file under unforeseeable is this. A passenger reportedly noticed cracks in the fuselage skin before boarding the aircraft. That passenger did not report the observation to the crew or to ground staff. A passenger saw the cracks in the fuselage before takeoff, said nothing, and the sky mentioned it about 24,000 feet later. 24. The Centralia underground mine fire has been burning beneath a Pennsylvania town for over 60 years. It is expected to continue for at least another 250 years. The fire began on May 27, 1962, when the Centralia Borough Council authorized burning the town's landfill, which had been placed in an abandoned strip mine pit that intersected with the Mammoth Coal Vein, a massive anthracite deposit. This is what placed in an abandoned strip mine pit means in practical terms. Someone put a garbage fire on top of a coal seam. Attempts to extinguish the fire in the 1960s were made, but proved insufficient. A government report in 1969 recommended a major excavation project to physically remove the burning material. Funding was not allocated. By the 1970s, residents were reporting carbon monoxide seeping into their basements. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy nearly fell into a sinkhole that had opened suddenly in a backyard, exposing a cavity where ground temperatures exceeded 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The federal government eventually spent approximately $42 million relocating most of the town's residents. The official population of Centralia, as of 2020, was 5 people. They lit a fire on top of a coal mine and called it garbage disposal. The coal mine has been responding ever since. 25. The Boston molasses flood of January 15, 1919, sent approximately 2.3 million gallons of molasses through the North End neighborhood in a wave estimated at 25 feet high, traveling at 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150. It is treated in popular history as one of the more eccentric industrial disasters on record, an almost absurd footnote. What gets left out of that version is that the storage tank at the Purity Distilling Company had been leaking since it was built in 1915. Consistently, for 4 years. Local residents reportedly collected molasses that seeped from the base of the tank for personal use, treating the chronic leak as a minor neighborhood perk rather than as evidence of a structural problem. Engineers and workers had observed the tank making cracking and groaning noises in the period before the failure. The company's formal response to complaints about the leaking tank was to paint it brown so the seeping molasses would be less visible against the metal surface. That is not what fixing a leak means. The resulting lawsuit became one of the first major class action cases in Massachusetts history. The tank had been leaking for 4 years. They painted it brown. That is not what fixing a leak means. 26. The Eschede train derailment on June 3, 1998, killed 101 people and remains Germany's worst peacetime rail accident. It is remembered as a sudden, unforeseeable mechanical failure that happened without warning at high speed. The specific type of rubber-cushioned wheel tire that failed had a known fatigue cracking problem. Incidents involving cracked tires of this design had occurred previously without catastrophic result, which is precisely how the normalization of a recognized risk operates in practice. German Federal Railway had received reports of cracked, rubber-cushioned wheel tires before Eschede and was in the process of modifying the wheel design across the fleet. The train involved in the crash had not yet been retrofitted. When the fatigued tire disintegrated at approximately 200 kilometers per hour, the derailed axle struck a switch mechanism that diverted the rear carriages into a road bridge support, causing the bridge to collapse onto the train. 101 people were killed. The crash led to the immediate withdrawal of the rubber-cushioned wheel design from service across the entire German high-speed rail fleet. The cracked wheels had already been reported. The retrofits were scheduled. The scheduling didn't include this train. Now it's concrete. 27. The Love Canal disaster did not happen because the city of Niagara Falls, New York, was unaware that the land beneath the neighborhood was a chemical waste site. The warning was literally written into the deed of sale. Hooker Chemical Company had buried approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste in the former Love Canal site between 1942 and 1953. When the Niagara Falls City School Board sought to acquire the land, Hooker initially refused. Under sustained municipal pressure, the company eventually sold the site for $1. The deed of sale included explicit language warning that the land contained chemical waste and disclaiming liability for any resulting injuries or damage. The school board built an elementary school on the site anyway. A residential neighborhood subsequently developed around it. By the 1970s, chemicals were visibly seeping through basement walls and pooling in backyards. Residents reported unusually high rates of miscarriage, birth defects, and illness. Love Canal became a national symbol of chemical waste mismanagement and directly led to the creation of the Superfund program in 1980, establishing the federal mechanism for cleaning up contaminated sites that exists to this day. The warning was in the deed. They built a school on it, then a neighborhood. Then they were confused about the chemicals. 28. The Swedish warship Vasa sank on its maiden voyage in Stockholm Harbor in 1628. It traveled approximately 1,300 meters before capsizing and killing an estimated 30 to 150 people. The ship had failed its own stability test in port before it ever left the dock. The test, in which 30 men ran back and forth across the deck to simulate rolling conditions, was stopped after 3 runs because the ship was listing so severely that the test officer feared it would capsize right there in the harbor. The results were reported to Admiral Fleming, who was overseeing the ship's deployment. Fleming acknowledged the findings. He ordered the ship to sail anyway. The reason is not obscure. King Gustav II, Adolf of Sweden, was awaiting the ship's deployment, and cancellation would have been politically problematic. A light gust of wind caused the ship to list shortly after departure. Water flooded through open lower gun ports, and the Vasa sank within minutes. The ship was raised in 1961 and is now preserved in a dedicated museum in Stockholm, where it stands as one of the most completely documented preventable maritime disasters in recorded history. The ship failed its own stability test in the harbor. They sailed it anyway, because the king was watching. 29. The Banqiao Dam failure in China in August of 1975 is one of the deadliest technological disasters in human history, with estimates of total deaths ranging from 85,000 to 240,000 people across Henan province. The disaster was classified as a state secret by the Chinese government and not publicly acknowledged for decades, which has contributed to its near invisibility in Western accounts. What is documented is this. During the dam's construction in the early 1950s, hydrologist Chen Xing warned that the dam's spillway capacity was insufficient to handle large floods and that the design was dangerous. He recommended increasing the number of sluice gates. He was overruled, labeled a political enemy, and removed from the project. In August of 1975, Typhoon Nina brought rainfall that far exceeded the dam's design parameters. Local officials attempted to open the sluice gates for an emergency discharge, but were reportedly unable to reach the authorities required to authorize the action in time. The dam failed on August 8th. The resulting flood destroyed dozens of downstream dams in a cascade failure. The man who said the dam would break was called a traitor and removed. The dam wrote his vindication in floodwater across 4 counties. 30. The La Crosse apartment tower fire in Melbourne in 2014 sent flames from the 8th floor to the 21st floor of a residential high-rise in approximately 11 minutes. The fire started from an unattended cigarette on a balcony. That detail tends to get most of the attention. What deserves more attention is the cladding. The lacrosse building used aluminum composite panels with a polyethylene core, a product that was explicitly prohibited for use on buildings over 3 stories under the relevant Australian Building Code provisions, precisely because of its fire performance characteristics. The material had been approved through a building certification process that allowed certifiers to accept alternative compliance pathways. Multiple parties in that approval chain either did not check or did not flag the cladding's non-compliance with fire performance requirements. The fire spread so rapidly across the exterior of the building because the cladding essentially acted as a continuous vertical fuel source. No one died, largely because the fire occurred at a time of night when residents were able to self-evacuate. The lacrosse fire was a direct forerunner of the Grenfell Tower disaster 3 years later in the United Kingdom. Industry warnings following lacrosse about widespread non-compliant cladding were not acted upon comprehensively before Grenfell. The cladding was illegal. The certifier approved it. The fire read the code correctly, even when the certifier didn't. 31. The Halifax explosion of December 6, 1917, is the largest human-made accidental explosion in history prior to the atomic era, and it leveled a significant portion of Halifax, Nova Scotia, killing approximately 2,000 people and injuring 9,000 more. It is remembered as a tragic maritime collision between 2 ships in a busy wartime harbor. What tends to get less examination is what happened in the roughly 20 minutes between the collision and the explosion. The French munitions ship Mont Blanc was carrying approximately 2,925 tons of explosives, including TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, and benzol. After the collision with the Norwegian ship Imo, the Mont Blanc caught fire. The crew, fully aware that the ship was carrying enough explosive material to devastate the surrounding area, abandoned ship. They did not communicate clearly to rescue personnel, or to the crowds gathering on the waterfront to watch the spectacle that the vessel was a floating bomb, rather than simply a burning cargo ship. Halifax Harbor was an extraordinarily busy wartime staging port. People watched from the shore. They didn't fly the "this ship will explode" flag, abandoned the burning ship without mentioning the explosives, and left a crowd watching from the waterfront. 32. The Sultana steamboat explosion on April 27, 1865, killed approximately 1,800 of the estimated 2,400 people aboard and stands as the worst maritime disaster in American history. It is almost completely unknown outside of specialist circles, partly because it was overshadowed in press coverage by the assassination of President Lincoln 2 weeks earlier, and partly because the victims were primarily Union soldiers returning from Confederate prison camps, many in severely weakened physical condition after years of captivity. The Sultana was legally rated to carry 376 people. The boilers had developed a crack during the upstream voyage. Rather than make the full repair recommended, a smaller, cheaper patch was applied in Vicksburg under time pressure. Military officials loaded approximately 2,400 passengers onto a vessel built for 376, with a patched boiler, in what subsequent investigations suggested may have involved a bribed military officer directing the prisoner transport to the Sultana. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded in the early hours of April 27th. Approximately 1,800 people who had survived years in Confederate prison camps died in the Mississippi River, days after liberation. The boiler had a known crack, the repair was a patch job, and they loaded 6 times the legal limit. The river got the paperwork right. 33. Minamata disease did not emerge as a public health mystery that took years to solve through the painstaking work of dedicated scientists operating without corporate interference. The Chisso Corporation's own hospital physicians identified the link between plant effluent and the neurological illness appearing in surrounding fishing communities as early as 1959. That is 5 years into a poisoning event that would ultimately be acknowledged publicly in 1968. What Chisso did with that internal finding was suppress it. The company then switched the outlet for its wastewater discharge to a different location, which did not stop the contamination. It spread it into a wider area of the bay. In 1959, Chisso offered small condolence payments to victims that included clauses preventing further compensation claims, even if the company were later found responsible. The disease, caused by methylmercury poisoning through consumption of contaminated fish, produced progressive sensory loss, difficulty walking, convulsions, and in severe cases, death. Approximately 2,955 people were officially certified as victims, though estimates of total affected individuals run significantly higher. Their own doctors found the cause. They buried the report, moved the pipe, and kept the factory running. The fish had already been eaten. 34. The MGM Grand Hotel fire in Las Vegas on November 21st, 1980, killed 85 people, making it the deadliest Nevada disaster of the 20th century. The fire started in a restaurant due to an electrical fault. That part is true. What is also true is that the electrical fault smoldered inside a wall for an estimated 8 to 10 hours during the night before it erupted catastrophically at approximately 7:10 in the morning. The building had been cited by fire safety authorities for code violations in the years before the fire. Nevada's fire code at the time did not require sprinkler retrofitting of existing high-rise hotels, and the hotel had not voluntarily installed sprinklers despite their known and documented effectiveness at containing exactly this type of fire. When the blaze finally erupted, most of the 85 deaths resulted not from the fire itself, but from smoke and toxic gases traveling through elevator shafts and corridors to upper floors where sleeping guests were overcome before they could reach exits. The disaster directly drove Nevada and federal legislation mandating sprinkler systems in high-rise hotels and resulted in sweeping adoption of modern hotel fire safety standards across the country. There were code violations on file, no sprinklers, and the fire had been burning inside a wall since the previous night. By breakfast, it had the whole building's attention. 35. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 garment workers in New York City on March 25, 1911, and it is almost always described as a tragedy caused by a workroom fire that spread too fast for escape. That description is technically accurate and almost entirely misleading. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company regularly locked stairwell doors and exits during working hours. The reason was practical and unsentimental. Management required workers to exit through a single checkpoint where bags could be inspected for stolen fabric scraps. When fire broke out, workers who could not reach the single open exit or the roof found themselves at locked doors. Many jumped from windows to escape the flames, falling to the sidewalks below in front of crowds who had gathered on the street. The factory owners had faced a prior fire at the same facility and had previously been acquitted in a separate safety-related lawsuit. They were charged with manslaughter following the 1911 fire and were acquitted again because the jury accepted that the owners could not be proven to have known the specific door was locked at the specific moment of the fire. They locked the doors to protect the fabric. The fire did not distinguish between fabric and the people trying to reach the door. 36. The de Havilland Comet was the world's first commercial jet airliner, and between 1953 and 1954, it experienced a series of catastrophic mid-air disintegrations that killed everyone aboard. These disasters are remembered as unforeseeable discoveries about jet-age metal fatigue, as though the engineers were operating in complete darkness. The Comet's fuselage had square windows. Square corners concentrate stress with every pressurization cycle, creating conditions for metal fatigue crack propagation. This physics did not require discovery. What was not fully understood at the time was the rate at which that concentration would progress in a pressurized aluminum fuselage cycling daily at high altitude. A prior non-fatal accident at Rome Airport in 1952 had shown structural stress cracking that, in retrospect, should have triggered a comprehensive re-examination of the design before additional aircraft were lost. After the crashes, the Royal Aircraft Establishment conducted landmark testing by repeatedly pressurizing a Comet fuselage submerged in a water tank and discovered the fatigue cracking mechanism around the window corners. The findings transformed aircraft design and certification standards globally, contributing to the oval windows, fatigue testing requirements, and pressurization cycle limits that define every commercial airliner built since. Square corners concentrate stress. The metal knew this before the engineers did, and it explained itself at 35,000 feet. 37. The Piper Alpha offshore oil platform explosion on July 6, 1988, killed 167 workers and remains the deadliest offshore oil disaster in history. It was triggered by a safety permit system failure, so straightforward in its mechanics that the accident investigation reads less like a mystery and more like a checklist of things that were not done. Maintenance workers had removed a safety valve for servicing and issued a permit indicating it was out of service. That permit was not adequately communicated to the next shift, which attempted to activate the associated pump, triggering an initial gas condensate release and explosion. The platform's fire control procedures required explicit authorization from the installation manager before automatic fire suppression systems could be activated. That authorization was not given. Two connected platforms, Tartan and Claymore, continued pumping oil and gas into Piper Alpha through their pipelines because their operators did not receive clear direction to shut down, feeding the fire with additional fuel as the situation escalated. The Cullen inquiry produced 106 safety recommendations and drove fundamental reforms of North Sea offshore regulation. The permit said the valve was out. Nobody told the next shift. Two neighboring platforms kept pumping fuel in because no one called them either. The paperwork was extremely thorough. 38. The Hyatt Regency Walkway collapsed in Kansas City on July 17, 1981, killed 114 people and injured more than 200 when two suspended walkways fell onto a crowded atrium lobby during a tea dance event. The investigation that followed produced one of the most studied examples of engineering failure in the history of structural design education. The original design called for walkway hangers supported by a single long-threaded rod running from the ceiling to both the fourth floor and second floor walkways simultaneously. During construction, a steel fabricator proposed changing this to a two-rod system. Under the modified design, the fourth floor walkway box beam now had to support both its own load and the full hanging weight of the second floor walkway below it. The engineering firm reviewed and approved this change without recognizing that it doubled the load demand on the fourth floor connection, a connection that, under the modified design, was already insufficient to meet code requirements for dead load alone, before any crowd loading was applied. Post-collapse analysis found the fourth floor connection could support only about 60% of the load required by building code under the modified design. Someone changed the design, someone approved the change, and nobody did the multiplication. The walkway eventually did it for them. 39. The Imperial Sugar Refinery explosion in Port Wentworth, Georgia, on February 7, 2008, killed 14 workers and injured dozens more in a combustible dust explosion that the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board had essentially predicted in a report published 2 years earlier. In 2006, following a series of combustible dust explosions at industrial facilities across the country, the CSB issued a comprehensive study specifically recommending that OSHA develop a binding national standard for combustible dust hazard management. Sugar dust, grain dust, wood dust, and coal dust are all capable of producing catastrophic explosions when suspended in air at sufficient concentrations near an ignition source. OSHA had issued advisory bulletins acknowledging the risk but had not promulgated a binding regulatory standard before the Imperial Sugar explosion. At the Port Wentworth facility, sugar dust had accumulated under conveyor belt enclosures and in enclosed belt tunnels. An initial explosion in the packaging building sent a pressure wave through those tunnels that lofted the accumulated dust and triggered a series of secondary explosions throughout the entire facility. The safety board had already written the report, recommended the regulation, and issued the warnings. The regulation wasn't written yet. The sugar didn't wait. 40. The Lac Mégantic rail disaster on July 6, 2013, killed 47 people when a runaway crude oil train derailed in the center of a Quebec town and ignited approximately 6 million liters of crude oil, destroying 40 buildings and incinerating the town center. The train had been left unattended on a mainline grade by a single crew member, which was permitted under a one-person operation approval that Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway had received from Transport Canada. The engineer had applied handbrakes on approximately 11 cars before leaving the train. Transportation Safety Board investigators determined that a minimum of 26 handbrakes should have been applied to hold the train on that grade. A fire had broken out on the lead locomotive while the train was parked. Local firefighters responded to the blaze and, in doing so, shut down the engine. That shutdown resulted in loss of air pressure to the automatic air brakes, which had been supplementing the insufficient handbrake application. The runaway train reached approximately 100 kilometers per hour before derailing in the town center. The Transportation Safety Board had previously flagged single-person train operation as a safety concern on multiple occasions. The brakes needed 26. There were 11. The Hill knew the difference immediately. 41. The workers and executives at the United States Radium Corporation knew that radium exposure was dangerous. That fact was established in Item 17. What deserves its own entry is what happened after the Radium Girls became sick and began demanding answers. When workers started developing severe jaw deterioration, bone fractures, and radiation-related illness, the company's response was not acknowledgement. It was strategy. The company hired a doctor who falsified medical reports attributing the workers' conditions to other causes entirely, including syphilis, a diagnosis that carried social stigma and deflected attention from occupational exposure. Independent researchers who identified the real cause had their findings suppressed through company interference. Several workers pursued legal action, despite being in severe physical decline. Some were so ill during proceedings that they could not raise their arms in court. The cases they brought and the public attention surrounding them contributed directly to occupational health and safety law in the United States, to an understanding of maximum permissible radiation exposure levels, and to the recognition that employers have legal obligations toward workers they knowingly expose to hazardous conditions. The company's second response to the problem it had created was to discredit the people the problem was killing. That strategy also failed, just more slowly than the workers deserved. 42. The W.R. Grace Company's handling of vermiculite mining in Libby, Montana, followed a pattern that should be familiar by now. Internal documents showed awareness. External communications denied the risk. Workers and community members paid with their health. The Libby mine was the world's largest vermiculite producer. The ore was contaminated with naturally occurring tremolite asbestos, a particularly dangerous fibrous form. W.R. Grace acquired the mine in 1963. Internal company documents obtained during litigation showed that the company was aware of health risks to workers by at least the late 1960s. Company memos discussed the legal and financial risks of acknowledging the hazard while simultaneously telling workers the dust exposure was within safe limits. Workers were not consistently provided with adequate protective equipment. The asbestos-contaminated vermiculite was also sold across the United States as attic insulation under the brand name Zonalite, spreading contamination into residential homes nationally. More than 400 Libby residents have died from asbestos-related disease. Over 3,000 have been diagnosed with asbestos-related illness. The EPA designated Libby a Superfund public health emergency, the first time that designation had ever been used under Superfund authority. The memos said dangerous. The dust masks said optional. The death certificates eventually settled the disagreement. 43. The I-35W Mississippi River Bridge in Minneapolis had been officially rated structurally deficient by federal inspectors since 1990. That rating did not mandate immediate closure. What it did mandate, in any reasonable institutional interpretation, was urgency. The bridge carried that rating through every subsequent inspection for 17 years, during which it was placed on a replacement schedule that kept it in active service. On August 1, 2007, a deck resurfacing project had concentrated approximately 578,000 pounds of construction equipment and materials on the bridge's central span, directly above the gusset plates that would fail minutes later. National Transportation Safety Board investigators determined after the collapse that the primary cause was undersized gusset plates, a design error from the bridge's original 1967 construction that were insufficient to carry the loads placed on them. 13 people were killed, and 145 were injured. The NTSB found that the Minnesota Department of Transportation had not identified the gusset plate deficiency, and that federal bridge inspection standards of the era were not sufficient to detect this class of design error. The bridge had been officially deficient for 17 years. They added 578,000 pounds of construction equipment to the center span. The gusset plates had been wrong since 1967. The math finally ran out on a Tuesday afternoon. 44. The Silver Bridge over the Ohio River collapsed on December 15th, 1967, killing 46 people in approximately 1 minute. The bridge used an I-bar chain suspension system rather than conventional wire cables, a design choice understood at the time of construction to be less redundant than cable designs. The specific vulnerability of the I-bar chain was this: if one link failed, the entire chain would lose integrity with no alternative load path. When a single I-bar link failed due to a stress corrosion crack that had developed over nearly 40 years of service, the failure propagated instantly. The crack that caused the failure was approximately 1/10 of an inch deep, essentially invisible to visual inspection, which was the primary bridge inspection method available in 1967. The design itself had been noted by engineers as carrying less redundancy than cable alternatives at the time it was built. The disaster prompted the creation of the National Bridge Inspection Standards in 1968 and the Federal Bridge Inspection Program, establishing systematic inspection requirements for the nation's bridge inventory for the first time in American history. One link, one crack, no redundancy. The design said if any piece fails, everything fails. One piece failed. The design kept its promise. 45. The Bhopal disaster's consequences did not end when the gas cloud dispersed on December 4, 1984. The Union Carbide plant site was abandoned after the disaster without comprehensive environmental remediation. Thousands of tons of toxic chemicals, including mercury compounds, volatile organic compounds, and pesticide residues, remained stored at or buried in the site for decades. Independent researchers and environmental organizations conducted testing of soil and groundwater around the former plant site and documented heavy metal and chemical contamination at levels far exceeding safe limits. Community members drawing water from nearby wells showed elevated contamination markers. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals documented elevated rates of birth defects, developmental disorders, and other health problems in children born to parents in the affected community after 1984, suggesting ongoing exposure through contaminated groundwater rather than solely from the original gas release. Dow Chemical, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, consistently denied liability for site cleanup, arguing the acquisition did not transfer environmental responsibility for pre-acquisition events. The dispute over site remediation remained unresolved for decades. They left decades' worth of chemicals in the ground, walked away from the property, and were then surprised to be asked about the water. 46. The Barings Bank collapse in February of 1995 wiped out one of Britain's oldest and most prestigious financial institutions because a single trader was simultaneously serving as both head trader and head of back-office settlement in Singapore. That dual role is explicitly prohibited in sound financial practice for a reason so obvious it is almost embarrassing to explain. If the same person controls trading positions and the reconciliation records for those positions, there is no independent check on either. An internal Barings audit in 1994 specifically identified this arrangement as a significant risk and recommended it be corrected. The recommendation was not acted upon, partly because Nick Leeson was considered a highly profitable trader whose operation generated significant apparent revenue for the bank. The apparent profitability and the mounting losses were, it turned out, in the same account. The error account, known internally as Account 8888, where Leeson concealed his positions, was visible in back-office systems and appeared in internal reports. Questions about it from Singapore and London were deflected and inadequately investigated. By the time Leeson fled Singapore, his hidden positions had accumulated losses of approximately £827 million, exceeding Barings' entire available capital. The bank was sold to ING for £1. The audit said fix the dual role. The bank said, but he's profitable. The profitability was in the same account as the losses. 47. The Westgate Bridge collapse in Melbourne on October 15, 1970, killed 35 construction workers when a partially completed steel box girder span failed. The span had developed a visible deformation, a buckle in the steel surface, that workers and site engineers were attempting to correct on the day of the collapse. The method chosen to correct the buckle was improvised on-site rather than derived from engineering calculation. The approach involved removing bolts along a splice joint to allow the span to flex and the buckle to reduce. Removing those bolts reduced the span's structural integrity at the precise moment it needed to carry its own weight. Engineers on site had concerns about the procedure. The project had also experienced an earlier partial collapse of a similar span at a different location weeks before this disaster, an event that did not result in a fundamental reassessment of the construction methodology being applied to the remaining spans. The Royal Commission that investigated the collapse found systemic failures in the project's engineering supervision and communication structure. The disaster contributed significantly to Australian workplace safety law reform and to international understanding of the risks specific to box girder bridge construction. The buckle was the warning. The fix for the buckle was to remove the bolts holding the span together. The span then demonstrated why the bolts had been there. 48. The Iroquois Theater in Chicago opened on November 23, 1903, and was marketed to the public as absolutely fireproof. The building's steel and masonry construction did, technically, survive the December 30th fire with its structure largely intact, which makes it one of the more grim examples of a marketing claim being simultaneously accurate and completely beside the point, given that 600 people died inside it. The theater was operating without a completed occupancy permit. Its exit doors were fitted with unfamiliar European-style latches that panicking audience members could not figure out how to open in a crowd. Bodies were found piled against these doors. When a spotlight ignited a curtain during a packed performance, stagehands attempted to lower the asbestos fire curtain designed to contain backstage fires. It jammed halfway down, allowing fire and hot gases to pour into the auditorium. The theater had no fire alarm connected to the city fire department. It was also over capacity, with approximately 1,900 people present against a listed capacity of 1,600. The building was fireproof. The exits were locked, with mechanisms nobody recognized. The curtain jammed. Fireproof turned out to describe only the walls, which survived the fire just fine, while watching everything else happen. 49. The Ringling Brother and Barnum and Bailey Circus fire in Hartford, Connecticut on July 6, 1944, killed 167 people, many of them children, when the big top canvas caught fire during an afternoon performance. The canvas had been waterproofed with approximately 1,800 pounds of paraffin dissolved in 6,000 gallons of gasoline. Let that treatment sit in your mind for a moment. The fire ignited at the edge of the tent and spread across the entire canvas roof within minutes, dripping burning paraffin onto the crowd seated below. The two main exit chutes used for moving big cats in and out of the tent were still positioned across the exits at the time of the fire, creating obstructions at points where the audience needed to move quickly and without hesitation. The circus had received fire safety warnings and citations in prior cities on the same tour. Hartford fire officials had inspected the circus. Enforcement of the required corrections had not been completed before the performance went ahead. They waterproofed the tent with gasoline. The exits had animal chutes blocking them. The fire inspection had already occurred. Enforcement was scheduled for later. 50. The Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston had a legal capacity of approximately 460 people. On the night of November 28, 1942, an estimated 1,000 people were inside. The overcrowding was not unusual for the establishment. When fire broke out in the Melody Lounge basement, it spread through the club's interior, which was lined with fabric, artificial palm trees, and paper decorative elements, with extraordinary speed. The main entrance of the club was a single revolving door, which jammed immediately with panicking patrons and created a fatal bottleneck. Other exits were locked, hidden behind curtains, or opened inward against the crush of people attempting to push through them. 492 people died. The disaster drove major reforms to building and fire safety codes across the United States, including requirements for outward opening exit doors, strict enforcement of occupancy limits, restrictions on flammable interior decor, and mandatory emergency exit lighting. Every requirement that emerged from this disaster corresponds directly to a condition that existed in the building on the night of the fire. The capacity was 460. There were 1,000 people inside. The main exit was a revolving door. The decorations were essentially kindling with a tropical theme. All four of these facts were true simultaneously. 51. The Pemberton Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts, collapsed on January 10, 1860, killing an estimated 145 workers and injuring hundreds more. The cast iron columns supporting the structure were of inferior quality and insufficient cross-section for the loads they were carrying, a fact that post-collapse investigation established clearly. What had come before the collapse is the part that makes this harder to file under unavoidable. The columns used in construction were defective, containing voids and impurities in the casting. The building had been assessed by at least one engineer who had expressed concerns about its structural adequacy. In the years after construction, additional heavy textile machinery had been loaded into the mill beyond its original design capacity, increasing the stress on columns that were already marginal. When the structure finally gave way, a fire broke out among the wreckage while survivors were still trapped inside, killing many who had survived the initial fall. The combination of structural failure and subsequent fire became a landmark case in early American industrial safety discourse and contributed to conversations about engineering accountability that were at that point still in their infancy as legal and regulatory concepts. The columns were hollow, where they should have been solid. The floors were heavier than designed. The building stood until it didn't, at which point it made its structural concerns extremely clear. 52. The General Slocum disaster killed over 1,000 people on New York's East River on June 15, 1904, and it remained the city's deadliest disaster for nearly a century. The passengers were mostly women and children from a German Lutheran church on an annual day trip. When fire broke out, crew members attempted to deploy fire hoses. The hoses rotted and burst under water pressure. They had not been properly maintained and were functionally useless at the moment they were needed most. The life preservers on the vessel were filled with granulated cork dust rather than solid cork, and some were reported to contain iron bars specifically to meet weight requirements during inspections without actually providing buoyancy. When passengers put them on and entered the water, the preservers either disintegrated or dragged people under. The Steamboat Inspection Service had certified the vessel as safe. The resulting scandal led to federal reforms of maritime inspection and the criminal conviction of the ship's captain, who was found guilty of criminal negligence. The life preservers had passed inspection by having the right weight. The weight was iron. The passengers discovered the distinction in the East River. 53. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia is one of the least discussed mass industrial health catastrophes in American history, and the reason it is under-discussed is not complicated. The victims were predominantly black laborers recruited from the South, and the legal and political systems of the 1930s were not structured to produce accountability for their deaths. The tunnel was bored through Gauley Mountain between 1930 and 1931 for Union Carbide. The rock being drilled was approximately 97 to 99% silica, an extraordinarily high concentration. Silicosis, the lung disease caused by inhaling crystalline silica dust, was a well-understood occupational hazard by the time this project began. Wet drilling techniques and respiratory protection were known preventive measures. They were not consistently implemented. Workers were exposed to extreme dust concentrations in poorly ventilated tunnel sections and began dying within months of project completion. Estimates of total deaths range from 476 in official records to over 1,000 among workers and their families when longer-term illness is included. Congressional hearings were held in 1936. The contractor reached modest financial settlements and faced no criminal liability. They knew it was silica. They knew silica killed lungs. They drilled faster and skipped the wet drilling. The dust kept the schedule. 54. The road bridge that stood over the rail line at Esheda was not designed to survive a derailment impact at operating speed. This was not an oversight specific to that bridge. European railway safety frameworks of the era did not require road bridges over high-speed lines to be designed to withstand derailment impact loads at all. When the derailed axle from the failing ice wheel struck the switch mechanism and sent rear carriages into the bridge supports, the supports did the only thing unprotected concrete supports can do when struck by a high-speed train. They failed. The bridge collapsed onto the train. Of the 101 people killed at Eshede, the majority died not from the initial derailment, but from the bridge collapse that followed it. Post-disaster analysis found that if the bridge had been designed with crash-resistant supports, or if the switch mechanism had been positioned away from the bridge structure, the death toll would have been dramatically lower, even given the initial wheel failure. Following Eschede, European rail safety standards were revised to include new requirements for infrastructure vulnerability assessment near high-speed lines, including specific consideration of bridge support design in derailment scenarios. The wheel failure was the spark. The bridge with no crash protection directly over the switch was the room full of kindling nobody had thought to clear. 55. The Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound on March 24, 1989, releasing approximately 11 million gallons of crude oil into one of the most ecologically sensitive marine environments in the world. Captain Joseph Hazelwood, who became the public face of the disaster, was not at the helm when the ship struck the reef. He had handed control to third mate Gregory Cousins, who was not certified to navigate in Prince William Sound, and had retired to his cabin. The Exxon Valdez's collision avoidance radar had been malfunctioning for over a year before the accident and had not been repaired, eliminating an early warning system that could have detected the vessel's proximity to the reef. The Coast Guard had discontinued a vessel tracking program in Prince William Sound for budget reasons, meaning the ship's deviation from its planned course was not detected externally before grounding. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990, mandating double-hull tanker construction, was passed directly in response to this disaster. The captain everyone blamed wasn't steering. The radar that would have helped was broken for a year. The tracking system that would have called them was canceled. The reef had been there the whole time. 56. The Aberfan disaster on October 21st, 1966, killed 116 children and 28 adults when a colliery spoil tip collapsed above the Welsh village and engulfed Pantglass Junior School. The school had just begun its morning session. The National Coal Board had been told repeatedly in writing that the tips above Aberfan were positioned over underground water springs that could destabilize them. The Aberfan Community Council had written to the NCB as recently as 1963, expressing concern about the safety of the tips above the village. The NCB's responses consistently reassured complainants that the tips were safe, without conducting adequate investigation of the spring and water table conditions beneath them. On October 21st, after a period of heavy rain, Tip 7 liquefied and collapsed, sending approximately 150,000 cubic meters of coal waste down the hillside. The subsequent Tribunal of Inquiry, led by Lord Justice Edmund Davies, found the NCB guilty of ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure of communication, and specifically noted that the warnings had been received and disregarded. NCB Chairman Lord Robbins initially misrepresented the situation publicly, claiming no one could have known about the springs. The council wrote the warning letters. The NCB wrote back, saying everything was fine. The tip had been reading the Geological Survey, not the NCB's letters. 57. The Buffalo Creek flood on February 26, 1972, sent approximately 132 million gallons of black coal slurry water through a narrow West Virginia valley, destroying 16 communities, killing 125 people, and leaving 4,000 of the hollow's 5,000 residents homeless. The structure that failed was not an engineered dam. It was a series of coal waste piles placed across a hollow to impound coal slurry. It had no engineering design, was not licensed as a dam, and had no spillway or overflow structure of any kind. A West Virginia Department of Natural Resources official had inspected the impoundment in 1967 and filed a written report calling it a potential major disaster. That report did not result in required remediation or closure. Pittston Coal Company officials inspected the structure on February 25, 1972, the day before the failure, and declared it satisfactory. The Pittston Coal Company's initial public statement after the disaster called the failure an act of God. The inspector said potential major disaster in 1967. The company said satisfactory on February 25th. The slurry said something different on February 26th. 58. The collapse of Barings Bank is sometimes presented as a case of fraud so sophisticated it defeated every institutional safeguard. That presentation requires you to ignore the audit. An internal Barings audit in 1994 looked at Nick Leeson's operation in Singapore and specifically identified the dual role arrangement in which Leeson controlled both trading positions and back office settlement, as a significant risk requiring remediation. The recommendation was not acted upon. The reason given, or at least the reason that can be reconstructed from subsequent accounts, is that Leeson was generating significant apparent profits, and nobody wanted to restructure a profitable operation. The apparent profits and the mounting losses were, as it turned out, housed in the same hidden account, Account 8888, which appeared in internal reports and generated questions from colleagues in Singapore and London that were deflected without adequate investigation. When Leeson fled Singapore in February of 1995, his concealed positions had produced losses of approximately £827 million, a sum that exceeded Baring's entire available capital. One of Britain's oldest banks was sold to ING for £1. The audit said fix the dual role. The bank said, but he's profitable. The profit and the loss were in the same account all along. 59. The Westgate Bridge collapse in Melbourne killed 35 construction workers on October 15, 1970. That number deserves to sit for a moment before the analysis begins, because the analysis involves a buckle and some bolts, and it is easy for the engineering detail to absorb the human weight of the number. The span had developed a visible deformation that engineers and workers were trying to correct. The correction method chosen was to remove bolts along a splice joint to allow the steel to flex and the buckle to flatten. The problem with removing bolts from a structure that is holding itself up is that the bolts were part of what was holding it up. Engineers on site had concerns about the procedure. Those concerns did not stop the work. The project had also experienced an earlier partial collapse of a similar span at a different location weeks before this disaster, and that prior event did not produce a fundamental reassessment of the construction methodology being applied to the remaining spans. You would think a partial collapse of an identical design element would produce exactly that kind of reassessment. You would be wrong. The buckle was the warning. The fix for the buckle was to remove the bolts holding the span together. The span then clarified why the bolts had been there. 60. The Iroquois Theater fire on December 30th, 1903, did not happen in a building that was secretly dangerous. It happened in a building that had been publicly, prominently, and repeatedly described as the safest theater in America. The marketing materials used the phrase absolutely fireproof. The owners believed it. The audience believed it. And in a narrow, structurally specific sense, it was accurate. The steel and masonry construction survived. The 600 people who died inside it did not. What the fireproof building contained, on a night when it was over capacity, with approximately 1,900 people, was a malfunctioning asbestos fire curtain that jammed halfway down, a complete absence of any fire alarm connected to the city fire department, and exit doors fitted with unfamiliar European-style latches that panicking audience members could not figure out how to open against the pressure of the crowd behind them. Bodies were piled against those doors. The theater had also opened 5 weeks earlier without a completed occupancy permit. The building was fireproof. The exits were locked with mechanisms nobody recognized under pressure. The curtain jammed. Fireproof described the walls, which survived just fine while 600 people could not get out. 61. The Hartford Circus Fire on July 6, 1944, is one of the few industrial disasters in American history that was literally set up with its own accelerant before anyone arrived. The Ringling Brothers Big Top canvas was treated with approximately 1,800 pounds of paraffin dissolved in 6,000 gallons of gasoline as a standard waterproofing measure. This was not an unusual treatment for canvas structures of the era. It was also, in retrospect, the construction of a very large, flammable object over a seated crowd of approximately 8,000 people. When fire ignited at the edge of the tent and spread across the roof within minutes, it dripped burning paraffin onto everyone below. The 2 main exit chutes used for moving big cats remained in position across exits at the time of the fire, creating obstructions at points where several thousand people needed to move fast. The circus had received fire safety citations from officials in prior cities on the same tour. Hartford inspectors had visited. Enforcement of required corrections had not been completed before the show. 167 people died, many of them children. They waterproofed the tent with gasoline. The exits had animal cages in them. The fire inspection had already happened. Enforcement was scheduled for later. 62. The Coconut Grove Fire on November 28, 1942, killed 492 people in Boston and remains one of the defining moments in the history of American fire safety regulation. Every major code change that followed the disaster corresponds precisely to a condition that existed in the building that night. The club had a legal capacity of approximately 460. There were roughly 1,000 people inside. The interior decor consisted of fabric, artificial palm fronds, and paper decorations that ignited and spread fire with extraordinary speed. The main entrance was a single revolving door that jammed immediately under the weight of panicking patrons. Other exits were locked, hidden behind curtains, or opened inward against the crushing pressure of the crowd. When the fire started in the basement Melody Lounge, it moved through the decoration-lined interior to the main floor in seconds. Most victims died from smoke inhalation and toxic gases rather than burns, in a building where the exits were inaccessible and the interior was essentially a fuel-lined corridor. The requirements for outward opening exit doors, occupancy limit enforcement, emergency exit lighting, and flammable decor restrictions that now govern buildings across the country all came from this night. The capacity was 460. There were 1,000 people inside. The main exit was a revolving door. All three were true at the same moment. 63. The contamination of the groundwater surrounding the abandoned Union Carbide plant site in Bhopal did not emerge as a surprise. The plant was abandoned after the 1984 disaster without comprehensive remediation. Thousands of tons of toxic chemicals remained stored at or buried in the site. Researchers testing soil and groundwater in the surrounding community documented contamination at levels far exceeding safe limits. Community members drawing water from nearby wells showed elevated chemical exposure markers. Studies published in peer-reviewed journals found elevated rates of birth defects and developmental disorders in children born to parents in the affected area after 1984, suggesting that exposure to contaminated groundwater was continuing to cause harm decades after the original gas release. Dow Chemical acquired Union Carbide in 2001 and consistently denied liability for site cleanup, arguing that the acquisition did not transfer environmental responsibility for pre-acquisition events. That legal position left the contaminated site unaddressed while the surrounding community continued to use water drawn from the ground beneath it. They left decades of industrial chemicals in the ground, walked away from the property, and were then surprised when people kept asking about the water. 64. The I-35W bridge in Minneapolis carried an official federal rating of structurally deficient for 17 consecutive years before it collapsed on August 1, 2007, killing 13 people. That rating is not an obscure technical classification. It is a formal federal determination that a bridge has elements in poor or worse condition that require monitoring and attention. The bridge had been placed on a replacement schedule while remaining in full daily service. On the day of the collapse, a deck resurfacing project had concentrated approximately 578,000 pounds of construction equipment and materials on the central span, directly above the gusset plates that the National Transportation Safety Board would later identify as the primary cause of failure. Those gusset plates had been undersized since the bridge's original construction in 1967. They were a design error that predated every inspection, every report, every rating. The additional load from the construction project pushed the already deficient connections past the point of failure. Federal bridge inspection standards at the time were not sufficient to detect this class of original design error. 17 years of official deficiency, 578,000 pounds of added load, and a design error from 1967. The math ran out on a Tuesday afternoon. 65. The Silver Bridge over the Ohio River failed on December 15, 1967, in approximately 1 minute, killing 46 people. The collapse triggered the creation of the National Bridge Inspection Standards and the Federal Bridge Inspection Program, establishing for the first time systematic requirements for inspecting the nation's bridge inventory. What this means, if you follow the timeline carefully, is that before the Silver Bridge fell, there was no comprehensive federal requirement to systematically inspect bridges at all. The Silver Bridge used an I-bar chain suspension design with a fundamental characteristic that engineers understood at the time of its construction. if one link in the chain failed, the entire structure would lose integrity with no alternative load path. There was no redundancy. The crack that caused the initiating link failure was approximately 1/10 of an inch deep, invisible to the visual inspection methods available in 1967. The design had been built with this vulnerability in 1928. It carried traffic for 39 years. When the crack reached critical size on a December evening with rush hour traffic on the deck, the chain did exactly what a non-redundant chain does when one link goes. One link, one crack, no redundancy. The design said if any piece fails, everything fails. One piece failed. The design kept its promise. 66. The Baia Mare cyanide spill on January 30th, 2000, released approximately 100,000 cubic meters of cyanide-contaminated water into the Somesh River, which flows into the Tisa and then into the Danube, carrying the contamination through Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania. An estimated 1,240 tons of fish died. Aquatic ecosystems along approximately 2,000 kilometers of river were devastated in what became one of Europe's worst environmental disasters since Chernobyl. The Oral Gold Processing Facility's tailings pond dam failed after a combination of heavy snow, rapid thaw, and rainfall overtopped and breached the containment structure. The dam had been constructed without independent engineering certification, meeting international standards for tailings dam design. Environmental groups and some regulatory observers had raised pre-existing concerns about tailings management at the facility before the spill occurred. The incident took place just 6 years before the Kolontar red mud spill in Hungary demonstrated that European industrial tailings management remained systemically under-regulated, suggesting that the lessons of Baia Mare had not been comprehensively absorbed into regulatory practice in the intervening period. The dam was too small, the pond was too full, and the winter was doing exactly what winters do. The river received the cyanide regardless. 67. The Buncefield Oil Storage Depot explosion on December 11, 2005, was described at the time as the largest peacetime explosion in the United Kingdom since the Second World War. It destroyed or severely damaged approximately 43 storage tanks and caused structural damage across a wide radius. No one died because it happened in the early morning hours when the site was largely unstaffed. 43 people were injured. The explosion began when a petrol storage tank overfilled because the primary level gauge, a float mechanism, was stuck and not accurately reporting the tank's contents. As petrol cascaded over the rim of the tank, a massive vapor cloud formed. The independent high-level switch, a separate backup system designed specifically to trigger an alarm and stop the filling process if the primary gauge failed, was also defective and did not activate. Both systems had failed. Neither failure had been identified or corrected before the night of the explosion. The Health and Safety Executive investigation found systemic failures in the maintenance and inspection of the safety critical level gauging systems at the depot. The first alarm was broken. The backup to the first alarm was also broken. The tank kept filling. Nobody noticed until the vapor cloud was larger than several city blocks. 68. The Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland carried 42 of the 63 fatalities from the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, making it the single deadliest location of the entire seismic event. The viaduct was a double-deck freeway structure built in the 1950s using non-ductile concrete column construction without the reinforcing details that modern seismic engineering would require. Following the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, which demonstrated the vulnerability of older California freeway structures with considerable clarity, the California Department of Transportation began a seismic retrofit program. The Cypress Viaduct had been identified as requiring retrofit work. It was not yet in the immediate priority group for funding and scheduling when the 1989 earthquake arrived. Post-earthquake estimates suggested the retrofit would have cost approximately $30 to $50 million. Reconstruction of the damaged freeways after the earthquake cost dramatically more than that. Following the disaster, the Cypress Viaduct was demolished and replaced with a surface-level boulevard rather than rebuilt as an elevated structure. The 1971 earthquake sent the memo. The retrofit program received it. The Cypress Viaduct was on the list. It was not yet at the top of the list when 1989 arrived. 69. The SE Fireworks Depot explosion in Enschede, Netherlands on May 13, 2000, killed 23 people, injured 947, and destroyed an entire residential neighborhood called Roombeek. The depot held a license specifying the quantity and category of fireworks it was permitted to store. Investigations after the disaster found that the actual inventory stored at the facility far exceeded those licensed quantities, and that professional display fireworks, which are more energetic than the consumer fireworks the license covered, were present without authorization. Multiple inspection visits had been conducted at the facility in preceding years. Investigators found that inspectors had not always verified actual storage quantities against licensed limits, or checked the classification of the materials being stored. The disaster began with a fire in one storage bunker. Detonation of the unlicensed inventory produced a series of massive explosions that destroyed the depot and heavily damaged or demolished approximately 400 homes in the surrounding neighborhood. Post-disaster investigation found systemic failures in the Dutch regulatory framework for fireworks storage, including unclear division of inspection responsibility between municipal and national authorities, and inadequate enforcement of compliance with licensed storage conditions. The license said this much: the warehouse held significantly more. The inspectors visited. The inventory was not counted. The neighborhood absorbed the difference. 70. The Kaprun funicular fire on November 11, 2000, killed 155 people inside an alpine tunnel in Austria and stands as one of the deadliest ski resort disasters in history. The funicular car's heater system used hydraulic fluid near heating elements, a combination that created a fire risk in the vehicle's design that was later identified as foreseeable given the materials involved. When a fire started in the lower car and the vehicle stalled in the tunnel, the geometry of the situation became immediately and lethally relevant. The tunnel ran on a steep grade, which meant it functioned as a chimney. Hot gases and flames were drawn rapidly upward through the enclosed shaft. Passengers who evacuated the burning car and attempted to flee upward toward what they believed was safety at the mountain station above were moving in the same direction as the fire and toxic gases. Many died from smoke and toxic gas inhalation while climbing. Fire suppression systems in the tunnel were found to be inadequate or non-functional. Emergency communication systems were also compromised. Criminal charges were brought against multiple defendants. The heater had flammable fluid near it. The suppression system was not working. The tunnel was a chimney on a slope. The physics of all three combined were not a surprise to the physics. 71. The Sunshine Mine Fire in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, on May 2, 1972, killed 91 silver miners and is among the deadliest hard rock mining disasters in American history. Miners began reporting smoke underground approximately 1 to 1.5 hours before a formal evacuation was ordered. That gap between the first reports and the declaration of a full emergency contributed directly to miners remaining underground as conditions deteriorated around them. The mine's self-rescuer devices, small emergency breathing units designed to provide short-duration breathable air during evacuation, were insufficient in number, were not positioned throughout the mine in accessible locations, and provided only 30 to 60 minutes of protection, which was inadequate for the distances involved in a mine of that size. Communication systems failed as fire-damaged underground infrastructure, leaving many miners unable to receive evacuation instructions or communicate their location to rescuers on the surface. 2 miners, Tom Wilkinson and Ron Flory, survived for 7 days in an area with breathable air before being reached. 91 of their colleagues died from smoke and carbon monoxide inhalation. The smoke was reported an hour before the evacuation order. The breathing devices lasted 30 minutes. The mine was deeper than 30 minutes. The arithmetic was not on the miners' side. 72. The Farmington coal mine explosion on November 20th, 1968, killed 78 miners at the Consolidation Coal Company's No. 9 mine in West Virginia. The mine had a documented history of methane accumulation problems. Federal inspectors had cited the facility for ventilation violations in 1968 and in prior years. The citations existed in the inspection record before the explosion. What they did not produce was the correction of conditions that made a methane ignition increasingly likely. When the explosion occurred, 78 miners were killed, and the mine was sealed to extinguish the resulting fire, leaving most of the bodies underground permanently. The Farmington disaster arrived in a year when coal mine fatalities were already at a historically high level, and it galvanized political support for comprehensive federal mine safety legislation in a way that prior disasters had not managed to sustain. The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, passed directly in response to Farmington, was one of the strongest occupational safety laws enacted to that point in American history. It established mandatory health and safety standards, inspection rights, and financial penalties for violations. The inspectors had already written the ventilation violations into the citation record. The methane did not read the citations. It read the ventilation. 73. The Herald of Free Enterprise capsized outside Zeebrugge, Belgium, on March 6, 1987, killing 193 people in approximately 90 seconds. The ship left port with its bow doors open. The assistant bosun responsible for closing them had fallen asleep. The officer whose duty it was to verify closure had taken up his position on the bridge without confirming the task was complete. The captain had no way to see the bow doors from the bridge. What makes this particular disaster nearly impossible to file under unforeseeable is a detail that emerges from the company's own correspondence. Senior officers of the Townsend Thorson fleet had previously submitted formal written requests to company management asking for warning lights to be installed on the bridge, specifically to indicate whether the bow doors were open or closed. The requests were denied. One management response reportedly questioned why the bridge needed to know whether the doors were open. The resulting public inquiry drove decades of legal development in English law around corporate accountability, culminating in the Corporate Manslaughter Act of 2007. Senior officers asked for a light to show whether the doors were open. Management said no. The doors were open. The sea came in through the gap where the light would have been. 74. The King's Cross Underground Fire on November 18, 1987, killed 31 people and fundamentally transformed fire safety management on the London Underground. The station used old wooden escalators. Fire safety reviews had repeatedly identified the accumulation of grease, dust, and debris beneath these escalators as a significant fire risk. Recommendations for more thorough cleaning had been made and incompletely implemented. London Underground had formally banned smoking throughout the network in 1987, following earlier fires. Enforcement was inconsistent. A discarded match or cigarette is believed to have ignited debris beneath escalator 4. What followed was not a straightforward fire. A previously unrecognized phenomenon, later termed the trench effect, caused the flame on the inclined escalator shaft to behave differently from a fire on a flat surface, tilting and shooting horizontally outward across the top of the escalator in a sudden flashover that engulfed the ticket hall. This specific geometry-dependent behavior had not been modeled or anticipated, though a smaller fire at a different station years earlier had shown characteristics that, in retrospect, were early evidence of the same phenomenon. All wooden escalators on the network were subsequently replaced. The grease was a known risk. The smoking ban existed without enforcement, and there was a geometry of fire in that shaft that nobody had calculated. 75. In the hours before the Deepwater Horizon blowout on April 20th, 2010, the data available on the rig was not ambiguous. It was anomalous, and the anomaly was ignored. A negative pressure test had been conducted to confirm the well was properly sealed. The test produced a pressure reading on the drill pipe that should have been 0 if the well was intact. It was not 0. Rig personnel accepted an explanation, later found to be incorrect, that the reading was caused by a bladder effect rather than by well integrity failure. After the test was declared successful, the crew began displacing drilling mud from the riser with seawater, removing a critical hydrostatic pressure barrier. Over the following 40 to 50 minutes, flow indicators showed anomalous returns consistent with formation fluid entering the wellbore, the first sign of a well control problem. The data was there. The blowout preventer, the last mechanical line of defense, failed when needed because it had a dead battery in its control pod and a design deficiency that prevented correct function under the actual blowout conditions. The negative pressure test was wrong and certified correct. The mud was being replaced with seawater. The blowout preventer had a dead battery. Each fact was in a different person's hands, and none of them were talking to each other. 76. The Collinwood School Fire in Lakeview, Ohio, on March 4, 1908, killed 172 children and 2 teachers in one of the deadliest school fires in American history. The building had 3 floors and a basement. All evacuating students were channeled through a staircase that led to a small vestibule with an outer door that opened inward. When fire was detected and evacuation began, students crowded into the vestibule. Those at the front could not open the inward opening door against the weight of the crowd pressing from behind. The pileup at that door is where most of the deaths occurred. School building fire safety requirements, including requirements for multiple exits, outward opening doors, and fire escapes, existed in some jurisdictions at the time. Enforcement and adoption across school districts were inconsistent, and many buildings of the era had comparable design vulnerabilities that had not been corrected. The Collinwood disaster accelerated school fire safety reform across the United States, and is cited consistently in fire safety history as a pivotal case, establishing why exit door swing direction is not a minor architectural detail. The door opened inward. The children ran toward it. The crowd made it impossible to open. An outward opening door costs exactly the same. Nobody had specified which direction it should swing. 77. The Malpasse Dam in southern France failed on December 2, 1959, killing approximately 423 people in the resulting flood. The dam was a thin double curvature arch design, an innovative and efficient structural form that transfers enormous forces to the rock at its abutments, and is therefore extremely sensitive to the condition of that foundation material. The foundation rock appeared competent on surface inspection, but contained a fault plane that was not fully characterized during the site investigation conducted before construction. In the months before failure, caretakers and engineers observed water seeping around and beneath the dam at levels that prompted concern. The response was to monitor rather than to take emergency protective action. After a period of heavy rainfall that raised the reservoir to near capacity for the first time since construction, the dam failed. Investigation found that water seeping through the fault plane had reduced the effective support of the rock beneath one abutment, and when foundation support was compromised, the thin arch structure failed rapidly. The seeping water was being monitored. The geology had not been fully mapped. The monitoring said, "Watch this." The fault said, "This is what you should have been watching." 78. The wildfire that destroyed Lytton, British Columbia, on June 30th, 2021, arrived one day after the village recorded a temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius, the highest temperature ever reliably recorded in Canada. The fire moved so fast that the village was largely destroyed in approximately 15 minutes. This is presented as an unforeseeable consequence of an unprecedented weather event. The Pacific Northwest heat dome that produced the record temperature was forecast by meteorological agencies several days before its peak. British Columbia had experienced escalating wildfire seasons throughout the 2010s, culminating in record-breaking seasons in 2017 and 2018. Provincial and federal reports had consistently identified increasing wildfire risk and recommended enhanced community wildfire protection planning. The village of Lytton did not have a community wildfire protection plan that had been actively rehearsed and was ready to execute in the minutes available when the fire arrived. Canadian climate scientists had been warning that exactly this combination of drought conditions, beetle-killed timber, and extreme heat events was creating dangerous wildfire exposure for interior communities. Climate reports said the fire risk was escalating for years. The heat dome was forecast. The evacuation plan existed on paper. 15 minutes is not enough time to execute a plan that was never practiced. 79. The BP Texas City refinery explosion on March 23, 2005, killed 15 workers and injured 180 in one of the worst industrial accidents in American oil refining history. A 2002 internal BP report had described the Texas City facility as having a checkbook mentality towards safety, meaning spending on minimum compliance rather than genuine safety culture, and had identified systemic safety management deficiencies. That report did not produce comprehensive reform before the explosion 3 years later. On the day of the incident, operators were restarting the Raffinet splitter tower after maintenance. The tower was overfilled because level indicators were malfunctioning, and operators could not accurately assess what was happening inside it. Flammable liquid overflowed into a blowdown drum and vented as a vapor cloud through an open stack that discharged directly to atmosphere, a design that had been specifically flagged as dangerous and recommended for replacement. Workers had been on 12-hour shifts during a 29-day turnaround, accumulating fatigue across weeks of extended overtime. Multiple alarms activated in the hour before the explosion. The Baker Panel review found that cost and budget pressures had negatively impacted safety across BP's U.S. refining operations. The level gauge was broken. The stack vented to atmosphere. The workers had been on overtime for 29 days. The report was on the shelf. All 4 facts were true at the same moment. 80. The Vajont Dam disaster on October 9, 1963, killed approximately 1,910 people in the valleys below the dam in northeastern Italy. The dam itself survived. Structurally intact, it still stands today. What destroyed the towns below was a wave generated when approximately 270 million cubic meters of the Montauk hillside slid into the reservoir in approximately 45 seconds, displacing the water in a mega tsunami that overtopped the dam by an estimated 250 meters and swept into the valleys on both sides. The instability of that hillside was not a secret. Geologist Leopold Müller had warned as early as 1959 that the southern slope of Montauk showed evidence of ancient landslide activity and recommended the reservoir not be filled to design capacity. Sadie, the operating company, conducted reservoir filling tests in 1960 and 1963 and directly observed that slope movement accelerated when the water level rose and slowed when it dropped. This relationship was measured, documented, and graphed. The water level was raised again. The slope had been communicating its position on this matter clearly and consistently through observable movement for years. The water was raised anyway. The slope then stated its case at full volume. 81. The La Conchita landslide of January 10, 2005, killed 10 people in a small coastal California community when debris from the bluff above the village swept through a neighborhood. The same hillside had produced a large landslide in March of 1995, just 10 years earlier, destroying 9 homes while killing no one. Following that 1995 slide, the United States Geological Survey and Ventura County officials issued formal statements acknowledging that La Conchita remained at ongoing geological risk from future slides. Residents were directly informed of this hazard. The county considered various options for the community, including land acquisition and managed retreat from the most exposed areas. Some residents chose to remain, despite being told, in writing, by government geologists, that the hill was likely to slide again. On January 10, 2005, following a period of exceptionally heavy rainfall, a portion of the same bluff failed again and sent debris into the neighborhood. The 2005 slide reactivated part of the 1995 landslide mass, which is consistent with what the geological assessments had predicted could happen. The hill had already slid once. The geologists said it would slide again. The residents said they understood the risk. The hill, having no interest in the conversation, slid again. 82. The Sewol Ferry capsized off the southwestern coast of South Korea on April 16, 2014, killing 304 people, the majority of them high school students on a field trip to Jeju Island. The vessel was carrying approximately 2,142 tons of cargo at the time, far exceeding its legal limit. Ballast water had been reduced to compensate for the raised center of gravity caused by the excess cargo, making the ship dangerously unstable in turning conditions. When the Sewol began listing severely after a sharp turn, the initial announcement broadcast over the ship's public address system told passengers to stay where they were and put on their life jackets. Passengers who followed that instruction and remained in their cabins were unable to evacuate as the ship capsized. Captain Lee Junseok was among the first to leave the vessel. He was later convicted of gross negligence and abandonment of persons in danger. Investigation found critical delays in the issuance of evacuation orders and systemic failures in the regulatory oversight of ferry operations in South Korea. The ship was overloaded to carry more freight. The ballast was reduced to compensate. The passengers were told to stay in their rooms. The captain left. The students who listened to the announcement did not survive. 83, the Rana Plaza building in Savar, Bangladesh, did not collapse without warning on April 24, 2013. It collapsed the day after an engineer assessed it, found major structural cracks, and recommended it not be used until repaired. The bank and retail shops on the building's lower floors read that assessment, accepted it, and closed. The garment factory managers on the upper floors told workers the building was safe and required them to report the following morning or face having their wages withheld. The building had been constructed on filled, swampy land with inadequate foundation design and non-compliant structural materials. It had experienced cracking incidents in prior years. Sohel Rana, the building's owner, was a local political figure with connections to the ruling party at the municipal level, a relationship that appears to have provided a degree of protection from enforcement of building safety standards. 1,134 workers were killed and more than 2,500 were injured. Sohel Rana was arrested attempting to flee to India following the collapse. An engineer condemned the building. The engineer's condemnation met a local politician's economic interest. The economic interest won the argument that morning. The building settled the dispute by afternoon. 84, the Markham Colliery winding accident on July 30th, 1973, killed 18 miners in Derbyshire when a cage carrying workers descended uncontrolled and struck the pit bottom. The brake mechanism on the winding engine had a retaining clip that fractured, causing loss of braking control. That description makes the event sound like a hidden failure, the kind of fracture that develops invisibly inside metal and announces itself only by braking. What the subsequent inquiry examined, with considerable care, was whether the condition of that component could or should have been identified in prior inspections, and whether the inspection standards and intervals applied to winding engine safety critical components were adequate for detecting this type of deterioration before it reached the point of failure. The examination of similar components at other collieries following the disaster found additional cracking in comparable parts, suggesting that the failure mode was not unique to this specific retaining clip at this specific mine, but was a broader characteristic of the component type under service conditions. The disaster led to a major review of winding equipment safety standards across British coal mines, and to updated inspection requirements for brake components throughout the industry. The component was inspected. Whether the crack was visible depends on which inspection standard you apply. The 18 men at the pit bottom had a very clear perspective on which standard had been applied to theirs. 85. The Sandoz Chemical Warehouse fire near Basel, Switzerland, on November 1st, 1986, was extinguished with large volumes of water. That water, contaminated with approximately 30 tons of agricultural chemicals, including pesticides and mercury compounds, flowed through drainage channels into the Rhine River. Downstream communities in Germany and the Netherlands received no timely warning with sufficient specificity about the nature of the contamination to take meaningful protective action before the plume arrived. The chemical inventory stored in the Sandoz warehouse had not been fully communicated to local emergency planners, which meant first responders fighting the fire did not have complete information about what the firefighting water was picking up as it ran off the site. An estimated 500,000 fish were killed. Aquatic invertebrate life along approximately 400 kilometers of the Rhine was effectively eliminated. Eels, which had been slowly recovering in the river, were devastated across their range in the affected section. The disaster catalyzed the creation of the Rhine Action Program and drove major improvements in chemical warehouse fire risk management and cross-border emergency notification protocols across Europe. The warehouse had chemicals that weren't fully listed. The fire was put out with water. The water went into the river. Downstream was not called until the fish were already dying. 86. The Chevron Richmond refinery fire on August 6, 2012, sent approximately 15,000 people to hospitals and clinics with respiratory complaints, chest pain, and related symptoms, making it the largest community health impact from a U.S. refinery accident in recent decades. The pipe that ruptured had been identified in prior inspections as showing significant corrosion and material thinning. Repair and replacement had been deferred on multiple occasions. Inspection records showed the degradation had been tracked over years without corrective action being completed. The fire produced a large vapor cloud that drifted over the surrounding community after the corroded crude oil pipe in the number 4 crude unit failed and released flammable hydrocarbon vapor that ignited. The Chemical Safety Board investigation found systemic failures in Chevron's corrosion management program and identified a corporate culture that tolerated deferred maintenance on safety-critical equipment as an acceptable operating condition rather than as an accumulating liability. 15,000 people sought medical treatment. The inspection said the pipe was corroding. The replacement was scheduled. The replacement was rescheduled. The pipe held its own deadline. 87. The Elk River chemical spill in West Virginia on January 9, 2014, contaminated the drinking water supply for approximately 300,000 people across 9 counties and triggered a do-not-use order that disrupted daily life, hospitals, schools, and businesses for days. The Freedom Industries storage facility had not been inspected by the West Virginia Division of Environmental Protection in approximately 22 years before the spill. The specific chemicals stored at the facility, crude MCHM used in coal processing, fell through gaps in the state's above-ground storage tank regulatory program. The tank that leaked was visibly deteriorated. The secondary containment wall surrounding the tank was also compromised. The facility sat approximately 1.5 miles upstream of the primary water intake for the Charleston drinking water system. The spill was initially detected not by a regulatory agency, but by a passerby who noticed a distinctive licorice odor coming from outside the facility fence and reported it. Congressional hearings followed. Regulatory reforms to above-ground chemical storage tank oversight were subsequently pursued. The tank hadn't been inspected in 22 years. The secondary containment was broken. The tank was upstream from the city's water intake. A pedestrian smelled licorice and noticed before the regulatory system did. 88. The Brumadinho Tailings Dam at Vale's Corrego do Feijão operation in Brazil collapsed on January 25, 2019, killing 270 people. The dam had received a stability certification just 4 months earlier, in September of 2018. That certification was subsequently found to have been based on geotechnical assumptions about the material properties of the tailings that did not accurately reflect actual conditions in the structure. The dam used upstream construction, a method of progressively raising the dam's crest using the tailings material itself, which is known to produce less stable structures than engineered downstream or centerline construction alternatives. The risks of upstream constructed tailings dams had been extensively documented in Brazilian and international mining industry safety literature following the Samarco disaster in 2015, just 4 years earlier. That prior disaster had generated widespread industry reviews and safety recommendations. Vale faced criminal charges following the Brumadinho collapse. Brazil and other mining jurisdictions moved to ban or phase out upstream construction method tailings, dams, and to mandate independent third-party auditing of tailings facility. Stability assessments. The dam was certified stable in September. It collapsed in January. The certification used assumptions that didn't match the actual material. The tailings matched the actual material. 89. The Samarco Fundão Tailings Dam in Brazil failed on November 5, 2015, releasing approximately 40 to 60 million cubic meters of iron ore tailings into the Doce River. The mud traveled the entire length of the river to the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 650 kilometers, causing damage to aquatic ecosystems that researchers were still documenting years later. 19 people were killed. Geotechnical instruments within the dam body had shown anomalous readings in the period before the failure, indicating that something in the dam's internal state was changing. A small seismic event, estimated at magnitude 2.4, is believed to have triggered the final liquefaction and failure of a dam that had accumulated factors, including saturation and seepage, that left it vulnerable to exactly that kind of triggering event. Downstream communities, including the town of Bento Rodriguez, were not evacuated before the tailings flood arrived. Emergency notification systems along the Doce River were activated too late or failed to reach all at-risk communities before the wave reached them. The instruments were reading anomalies. The notification system existed. The dam failed on a small vibration that it would have survived if the other factors hadn't already been present. The Doce River is still recovering. 90, the Tangshan earthquake on July 28, 1976, killed an estimated 242,000 to 655,000 people and remains one of the deadliest seismic events in recorded history. In the days and hours before the earthquake, residents and local officials in and around Tangshan reported multiple anomalous phenomena, including unusual animal behavior, changes in well water levels, ground deformation, and luminous atmospheric events. These were phenomena that Chinese earthquake researchers had documented as potential precursors in connection with prior earthquakes, including the 1975 Haicheng earthquake, for which a successful prediction had prompted evacuation and saved thousands of lives. Some local officials attempted to raise earthquake risk concerns before the Tangshan event. China's political environment during the Cultural Revolution had created conditions in which scientific debate was constrained, and researchers who had successfully predicted Haicheng faced political restrictions on continuing their work. Tangshan's building stock, largely unreinforced brick masonry construction, was exceptionally vulnerable to seismic shaking, and the near-total collapse of buildings across the city reflected both the earthquake's intensity and the fragility of the structures housing the population. The animals left. The wells changed. The ground moved. The political system was not accepting earthquake predictions that year. 91, the Soma coal mine explosion on May 13, 2014, killed 301 miners in western Turkey in the worst mining disaster in Turkish history. The mine had been inspected by government safety inspectors in the months before the explosion. Post-disaster reporting indicated that those inspections had not identified or produced corrective action on serious safety deficiencies present at the facility. The main opposition party in Turkey's parliament had submitted a motion weeks before the disaster, calling for a formal investigation into safety conditions at the Soma mine specifically. The ruling majority voted it down. The fire that caused the mass fatalities began in a transformer room and spread through old wooden support structures, producing carbon monoxide that moved through the mine and killed workers across a wide area underground. Emergency evacuation and self-rescue equipment was subsequently found to be inadequate for the distances and conditions involved in extracting workers from a mine of that depth and layout. Turkey's mine safety record at the time ranked among the worst of any OECD member country. Parliament was asked to investigate the mine 3 weeks before the disaster. Parliament said no. The mine provided its own findings shortly after. 92, Purdue Pharma began marketing OxyContin in 1996 with the specific claim that its extended-release formulation resulted in a lower addiction risk than immediate-release opioids. That claim was not supported by clinical trial evidence. It was nonetheless placed in marketing materials, communicated to physicians by sales representatives, and used to distinguish OxyContin in a crowded pain management market. Internal Purdue documents and accounts from former sales representatives described company awareness of widespread OxyContin misuse, pill mill prescribing patterns, and diversion into illicit markets. This awareness did not stop the marketing program. A 1995 FDA medical review that served as the basis for OxyContin's approval included language about reduced addiction potential that the FDA official who wrote it later acknowledged was not supported by clinical evidence and should not have been included. Purdue Pharma eventually pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges of misleading regulators, doctors, and patients about the drug's risks. The opioid crisis is estimated to have caused over 500,000 deaths in the United States between 1999 and 2019. The addiction data existed. The sales force knew what was happening. The marketing said it was safer. The approval had a sentence in it that wasn't supported by evidence. 500,000 people are in the gap between the marketing and the clinical data. 93. The Walkerton water contamination crisis in Ontario, Canada, in May of 2000, sickened approximately 2,300 people and killed 7 when E. coli O157, H7, and Campylobacter entered the municipal water supply. The Public Utilities Commission operators responsible for the system had been falsifying water quality records for years, reporting chlorination residuals that were not being achieved in practice. The Ontario provincial government had eliminated mandatory water testing by the Ministry of Environment in 1996 as part of budget reductions, shifting responsibility for testing to operators themselves and removing the external oversight layer that would otherwise have had the best chance of catching falsified records. In late May of 2000, heavy rainfall caused agricultural runoff, likely from cattle manure spread near a shallow municipal well, to enter the water system. The inadequate chlorination did not eliminate the pathogen load. Justice Dennis O'Connor's subsequent inquiry report found that both the operational failures of the PUC and the provincial government's cuts to water safety oversight were necessary conditions for the disaster, meaning that neither failure alone would have produced the outcome. They required each other. The records were falsified. The oversight was eliminated. The manure was near the well. The rain came. 3 separate decisions had to align to produce this outcome. They aligned. 94. The Eastland steamship rolled over at its dock in the Chicago River on July 24th, 1915, killing 844 people, more than perished from any single ship in the Titanic disaster. And yet the Eastland remains almost entirely unknown outside specialist circles. The ship had a documented history of dangerous listing on prior voyages. Passenger accounts and crew records from earlier trips describe the vessel's tendency to lean alarmingly, and at least 2 prior incidents had required emergency ballasting to correct dangerous lists before departure. In the years before the disaster, the Eastland had been modified multiple times, including the addition of heavy lifeboats required by new post-Titanic regulations. These additions raised the ship's center of gravity without a corresponding improvement to the hull's underwater form, worsening the inherent stability problems that had already been producing alarming lists on previous crossings. On the morning of July 24th, with approximately 2,500 passengers aboard for a company picnic excursion, the ship began listing at the dock as passengers moved around. Water entered through open portholes. The ship rolled completely onto its side in the Chicago River. It had listed dangerously before. Engineers had concerns on record. New safety regulations added weight to the top of an already unstable vessel. The safety equipment designed to prevent one disaster contributed to another. 95. Transport Canada approved Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway's application to operate trains with a single crew member, an exemption from standard 2-person crew requirements, despite the railway having one of the worst safety records among Canadian railways at the time of the application, with multiple derailments and regulatory violations in the preceding years. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada had flagged single-person train operation as a safety concern on multiple occasions before the Lac-Mégantic disaster, specifically noting the increased risk profile when a sole operator becomes incapacitated, distracted, or must leave a train unattended. MMA's exemption came with conditions. Whether those conditions were being adequately monitored and enforced was a question the TSB examined in its investigation of the July 2013 disaster. The regulatory history is clear enough. A regulator with documented concerns about single-person operation approved it for a railway with a documented poor safety record on a route that included mainline grades. The TSB recommended banning single-person operation for trains carrying dangerous goods following the disaster. Transport Canada moved to implement the restriction afterward. The railway had a poor safety record. The regulation said 1 person was enough. 1 person left the train on a hill. The Transportation Safety Board had already written the recommendation to fix this before anyone died. 96. The opioid epidemic's origins involve a regulatory approval that rested partly on language that the person who wrote it later said should not have been there. That single fact deserves more attention than it typically receives. The 1995 FDA review of OxyContin included a statement about reduced addiction potential that was incorporated into the drug's approved labeling and subsequently used by Purdue Pharma's sales force to differentiate the product to physicians. The FDA official who authored that language later acknowledged it was not grounded in clinical evidence from the submission. The drug entered the market with a safety claim embedded in its official label that the agency's own reviewer subsequently disavowed. Purdue's sales representatives were meanwhile being briefed on reports of misuse and diversion that the company's own internal tracking systems were producing, while the marketing program continued without modification to the core claims. The company's position was that addiction events reflected patient misuse rather than product characteristics. That position was maintained, while internal correspondence showed awareness of patterns that were inconsistent with isolated misuse. The regulatory approval had unsupported language. The marketing used that language. The internal reports contradicted the marketing. The public saw the marketing. 97. The SS Eastland's stability problems were not discovered after the disaster. They were documented before it, experienced by passengers on multiple crossings, managed through emergency ballasting on at least 2 prior occasions, and then compounded by structural modifications that made a ship with known stability issues heavier at the top. The post-Titanic maritime safety reforms that required the addition of heavy lifeboats to passenger vessels were designed to prevent one category of death at sea. Applied to a vessel with an existing and documented stability deficit, those reforms created the conditions for a different category of death entirely. 844 people died in the Chicago River on a sunny summer morning at a dock, not at sea in a storm, not in the open water, but tied to a pier in a city river in front of witnesses. The modifications were applied without a comprehensive reassessment of the vessel's overall stability profile under the new load conditions. The stability problems were known. The modifications were required by law. The combination of the two was not examined before the ship boarded 2,500 passengers. You cannot add significant weight to the top of an unstable structure and expect the structure to become more stable. The Eastland demonstrated this at the dock. 98. The Tenerife runway collision on March 27, 1977, killed 583 people and remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. The KLM Boeing 747 began its takeoff roll without receiving air traffic control takeoff clearance, in conditions of heavy fog that made visual confirmation of the runway ahead impossible. The KLM first officer expressed uncertainty about whether the aircraft was cleared for takeoff before the roll began. The captain's response effectively ended that conversation, and the roll continued. The flight engineer also briefly raised the question of whether the Pan Am aircraft ahead had cleared the runway. Both concerns were raised and not acted upon. The KLM captain was one of the most senior pilots in the KLM fleet, serving as the airline's chief pilot training officer at the time. Investigators noted that this authority may have inhibited junior crew members from pressing their doubts more forcefully at the critical moment. The disaster drove the global adoption of crew resource management training in aviation, the systematic approach to ensuring all crew members can effectively raise safety concerns regardless of rank, and of standard phraseology requirements that eliminated ambiguous language from clearance communications. The first officer had a doubt. The flight engineer had a question. The captain had 583 people's worth of institutional authority. CRM training exists because of what happens when those 3 facts occupy the same cockpit. 99. The Beirut port explosion on August 4th, 2020, killed at least 218 people, injured approximately 7,000, left an estimated 300,000 people homeless, and caused damage estimated at $15 billion in a country already in severe economic crisis. Approximately 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate had been stored in Hangar 12 at the port of Beirut since 2014, when it was offloaded from an abandoned cargo ship and never moved. Lebanese customs officials sent at least 6 formal written requests to judicial authorities between 2014 and 2017, asking for authorization to re-export, sell, or otherwise dispose of the material, explicitly describing the hazard it represented. None of those requests produced a response that resulted in action. The ammonium nitrate sat in an unsecured warehouse in inadequate storage conditions for 6 years, while the letters requesting guidance accumulated without answer. Welding work being conducted near the hangar on the day of the explosion is believed to have initiated the fire that triggered the detonation. 6 letters said, "There are 2,750 tons of explosive material in the port. Please tell us what to do with it." 6 years. No answer. The ammonium nitrate provided its own answer. 100, the 1900 Galveston hurricane, killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people in the deadliest natural disaster in American history, and it is remembered as a catastrophe that arrived without warning. That memory requires setting aside what Willis Moore, the U.S. Weather Bureau chief, did with the warnings that existed. Cuban meteorologist Benito Viñas had developed highly accurate hurricane tracking methods, and Cuban forecasters tracking the storm sent warnings about its trajectory and intensity. Moore dismissed them. He had an ongoing professional conflict with Cuban meteorological services over institutional authority, and had issued instructions that downplayed the hurricane threat to the Galveston office. Isaac Klein, the Weather Bureau's local meteorologist, had written a paper in 1891 arguing that Galveston was not at serious risk from major hurricanes, a position he later retracted. And this professional stance may have influenced how incoming storm data was interpreted locally. Galveston's city engineer had previously recommended constructing a seawall to protect the low-lying island city. City officials had declined the expense. A seawall was constructed after the disaster, and subsequent major storms caused dramatically lower loss of life. The Cubans tracked the storm and said it was serious. Washington said the Cubans were wrong. The local forecaster had a paper saying Galveston was safe. The seawall had been declined on cost grounds. The hurricane read none of these documents. 101, in October of 2019, 3 months before the first publicly reported cases of COVID-19, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security ran a pandemic tabletop exercise called Event 201 that specifically modeled a novel coronavirus causing a global pandemic and identified critical gaps in international response capacity. The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, a joint initiative of the World Health Organization and the World Bank, published a report in 2019 warning that the world was not prepared for a fast-moving, virulent respiratory pathogen pandemic. The United States had maintained a National Security Council directorate specifically dedicated to pandemic preparedness. It was disbanded in 2018. China reported a cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown cause in Wuhan to the WHO on December 31, 2019. Genome sequencing confirming a novel coronavirus was completed and shared internationally by January 10, 2020. The window between that knowledge and the WHO's declaration of a pandemic on March 11, 2020, involved critical weeks in which the international response lagged behind the virus's actual spread. They ran the simulation in October of 2019. The simulation said the world wasn't ready. The stockpiles had been assessed. The dedicated office had been closed. The report said fast-moving respiratory pathogen. 3 months later, the fast-moving respiratory pathogen arrived and found exactly what the simulation said it would find. Now ask yourself which warning you are currently holding, reading, and filing away, because this list didn't end in 2020. It ends with you. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.